Before we begin this journey, make sure you subscribe to the channel and tap the notification bell so you'll be among the very first to see every new episode the moment it's released. For centuries, Axum had stood like a mountain, strong, confident, and unshaken. Its ships crossed oceans, its kings carved their names into stone, its people lived with pride, knowing they belonged to a kingdom respected across the world. But every great mountain has a moment when the winds begin to change. At first, the changes were small. A few merchants complaining that fewer buyers were arriving from distant lands. A few courtiers whispering that gold shipments were not as heavy as they used to be. A few farmers noticing that the rains came later and ended sooner. Nothing alarming. Not yet. Just small signs. The kind that often appear before a storm. The rise of Arabia had already changed the Red Sea. Trade routes that once flowed naturally toward Axum were now bending toward new Arabian towns. Caravans that had depended on Axum's ports were discovering new paths in the desert. Bit by bit, Axum's hold on the region loosened, like fingers slowly slipping from a rope. Still, life continued. Markets were open. Children played. The stelae stood as they always had, and Axum's kings believed the kingdom would recover, as it always had before. But nature had a different story to tell. One year the rains came late. The next year they came even later. Streams that once filled with clear water began to dry. Farmers looked at their cracked fields and prayed for the sky to open. Villages that had thrived for generations suddenly found their harvests shrinking. In Axum, where the highlands had always been green and generous, this was unusual and unsettling. By the time the kingdom realized what was happening, the drought had already stretched across many seasons. Rivers shrank into narrow threads. Wells deepened. People walked farther to find water. Livestock became thinner. And families who had never worried about food now began to measure every handful of grain. Axum was strong, but even strong kingdoms feel the weight of hunger. And hunger brings something else: movement. Families began to leave the dry zones, searching for places where the earth was still soft and alive. Villages shifted, populations moved. For the first time in centuries, the highlands trembled, not with war, but with nature's quiet, steady pressure. At the same time, Axum's foreign connections weakened. The world that once seemed so close, Rome, Persia, Arabia, India, felt suddenly far away. Fewer ships visited Axum's ports. Fewer letters arrived from other courts. Fewer traders brought their goods. The Red Sea, once Axum's proud highway, became a quieter place. Isolation settled over the kingdom like a long, slow dusk. And isolation meant fewer allies, fewer trade partners, and fewer opportunities to rebuild. Yet even in these difficult times, Axum did not fall apart. Its people were resilient. They had survived wars, famines, and shifting powers before. The churches remained places of strength. The old traditions held families together. Mothers taught their children the songs of the kingdom. Fathers carved new tools and found new ways to farm the drying land. But every year the drought grew deeper. Every year more villages moved. Every year the kingdom shrank a little further. Some historians say this was the moment Axum's great cities began to empty. Not all at once, slowly. Families leaving, one by one. Streets that had once echoed with merchants and musicians became quieter. Houses that once glowed with evening firelight stood empty, stones cooling in the night. And yet, the kingdom's spirit did not fade. In churches lit by oil lamps, monks copied sacred books. In homes made of stone and wood, parents told stories of the old kings. In the countryside, farmers still planted, hoping the rains would return. Axum was struggling, but it was alive. Hour 6 is the hour of resilience, of waiting, of hoping, of holding on to identity even when the world grows dark. And as this hour draws to its close, the drought finally reaches its most difficult point. Entire regions are too dry to sustain life. People move deeper into the highlands, seeking safety. Trade becomes rare. Diplomacy grows thin. And Axum, once the gateway between Africa and the world, begins to turn inward. But kingdoms do not end only because the rains stop. Something else was coming. A new kingdom rising in the south, a new chapter in Ethiopian history, a transformation that would reshape the legacy of Axum, not destroy it. Hour 6 ends with a simple truth whispered across the highlands: we will endure. We always have. Axum, once a kingdom that touched the seas and traded with Rome, Persia, and India, was no longer the bustling empire it had been. The Red Sea ports that once overflowed with ivory, gold, spices, and exotic animals now echoed with emptiness. Ships arrived less frequently. Trade caravans took new routes that bypassed the kingdom. Wealth and power, once carried by the hands of merchants and kings, began to trickle away like water through cracks in a stone wall. And yet, life in Axum's highlands continued. Children played in the shadow of stelae that had once proclaimed the glory of kings. Farmers worked the fields as best they could, even as the rains became less reliable. Priests and monks kept their lamps lit at night, copying sacred texts in Ge'ez, keeping faith alive when kingdoms faltered. Even as Axum's political and economic influence waned, its culture endured. The empire's legacy did not vanish with the silence of its ports. Axumite architecture, its monumental stelae, its coins, and its churches all carried whispers of a civilization that had once been a bridge between continents. And this spirit of endurance became the foundation for what was to come. With Axum in decline, regional powers in the Ethiopian highlands began to rise. Local chieftains and small kingdoms took control of lands once governed from the distant capital. Out of these shifting powers emerged a dynasty that would carry the legacy of Axum into a new age: the Zagwe. The Zagwe dynasty was not a direct continuation of Axum's kings, but it respected the empire's history and faith. They established their center of power in the Lasta Mountains, south of the old Axumite cities. From these rocky highlands, the Zagwe rulers ruled a kingdom that was smaller in territory than Axum at its height, but deeply connected to its cultural and religious roots. Among the Zagwe kings, one stands out above all: King Lalibela. He was not a conqueror in the way Axumite kings had been. He did not march armies across the Red Sea or trade with Rome and India. Instead, he built a new Jerusalem in stone, a kingdom that spoke to the soul, not just the body. Lalibela carved churches out of living rock, cutting entire structures from the mountains themselves. His vision was inspired by the Christian faith carried down from Axum, but he transformed it into something uniquely Ethiopian. The rock-hewn churches of Lalibela became more than buildings. They became symbols of survival and continuity. They reminded the people that even if an empire fades, its spirit can endure. In these churches, the chants in Ge'ez, the prayers and the rituals preserved the language and faith that had flourished under King Ezana of Axum. Lalibela's work was a bridge, connecting the ancient empire to the medieval kingdom that followed. Meanwhile, the highlands of Ethiopia became a place of refuge and adaptation. Farmers learned to work with less rainfall, planting resilient crops and tending livestock with care. Monks and priests protected sacred manuscripts. Families moved closer to the mountains where water and fertile land were more reliable. In the midst of change, Axum's culture and faith adapted, ensuring that the people carried their heritage forward. The decline of Axum also taught a new generation the importance of resilience. They learned that kingdoms do not always fall with a loud crash. Sometimes they fade slowly, like a sunset behind the mountains. And sometimes in that fading, new opportunities arise. The Zagwe dynasty, small but determined, used this opportunity to create a kingdom that was spiritually rich, culturally strong, and politically stable. Trade, while reduced, continued on a smaller scale. The Zagwe kings may not have commanded the oceans like Axum, but they managed the highlands, the rivers, and the valleys. They controlled the flow of local goods, honey, grains, cattle, and some gold, and maintained connections with neighboring regions. They understood that survival in a changing world required adaptation, not conquest alone. And yet, despite the Zagwe's stability, the memory of Axum's glory never faded. Elders told children stories of the great stelae, the royal coins, the armies that crossed the Red Sea, and the kings who had carried Christianity into Africa. Even as cities emptied and trade diminished, these stories carried the echo of an empire that had once been greater than many of the kingdoms known to the world. Children grew up knowing the names of Ezana and other Axumite kings, learning that greatness is not measured only in power or wealth, but in faith, culture, and endurance. By the time Lalibela's churches were completed, the Kingdom of Axum had already faded from history's central stage, but its influence was everywhere. The Zagwe rulers may have controlled less land and fewer people than Axum at its peak, but they wielded the greatest power of all, the ability to preserve identity, faith, and culture. The torch that Axum had lit centuries before now burned brightly in a new generation, adapted to the challenges of a changed world. The story of the decline of Axum and the rise of the Zagwe teaches an important lesson. Empires may fall, but their ideas, beliefs, and spirit can endure. Axum's stone, faith, and language became the foundation upon which the Zagwe would build. And in this way, the story of Ethiopia continued, linking the ancient world to the medieval, the mountains to the people, and the past to the present. Even today, the churches of Lalibela, the traditions of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, and the memory of Axum's kings remind the world that civilizations are not measured solely by their borders or armies, but by the legacy they leave behind. Axum may have disappeared from maps, but it never disappeared from the hearts and minds of its people. Its decline was not an end. It was a transformation, a passing of the torch, and the birth of a new chapter in Ethiopia's history. And so, as the seventh hour draws to a close, we see the beauty of continuity. We see that greatness can survive not only in stone and coin, but in faith, culture, and memory. Axum's shadow stretches long, touching Lalibela, the Zagwe kings, and the Ethiopia of today. The story of a lost empire becomes a story of resilience, adaptation, and hope for generations to come. If you're enjoying this journey, don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe. And tap the notification bell so you'll be among the very first to see our next episodes as soon as we release them. After Axum's decline, the highlands of Ethiopia became the cradle of a new era. The Zagwe dynasty ruled from the Lasta Mountains, a rugged and fertile land where rivers ran through valleys and cliffs rose toward the sky. The mountains were not just protection. They were a home where culture, faith, and tradition could flourish. The Zagwe kings understood that their strength did not lie in controlling distant trade routes or vast armies, but in preserving the soul of a civilization. They inherited more than land. They inherited the faith, language, and monuments of Axum. In their hands, the memory of an empire centuries old became a living tradition. King Lalibela, perhaps the most famous of the Zagwe rulers, had a vision that would define medieval Ethiopia. He dreamed of a new Jerusalem carved directly from the mountains. Over decades, he ordered the construction of rock-hewn churches in the town that now bears his name. Each church was a masterpiece of faith and engineering. Halls, courtyards, tunnels, and intricate carvings created entirely from living rock. Lalibela's churches were not only places of worship, they were symbols, a tangible link between the distant past of Axum and the present. The faithful could walk through stone streets and corridors, tracing the continuity of a kingdom that had survived conquest, decline, and the shifting tides of history. In the Zagwe period, Ge'ez remained the language of faith. Priests and monks copied scriptures, preserving not only religious teachings, but also the wisdom of centuries. The chants, hymns, and rituals carried from Axum's courts to Lalibela's mountains created a thread that connected generations. Children learned stories of King Ezana, the first Christian king of Africa south of the Sahara, alongside tales of Lalibela's miracles and vision. While Lalibela and the Zagwe focused on spiritual strength, Ethiopia's medieval kingdoms also engaged in governance, defense, and diplomacy. They controlled the highlands with care, establishing fortresses in key valleys and trade routes, ensuring that towns and villages remained safe. They negotiated with neighboring peoples, maintained alliances, and continued to foster trade, albeit on a smaller scale than the Axumites had managed. Christianity became not just a religion, but the identity of the kingdom. Monasteries in remote highlands became centers of learning. Art, music, and architecture reflected centuries of Axumite influence. Even as the political reach of the Zagwe was limited compared to the Axumite Empire, the cultural and spiritual power of the kingdom grew stronger. The legacy of Axum was visible everywhere. The stelae, although aging and worn, reminded the people of a time when kings ruled over seas and continents. The coins and inscriptions were evidence that Ethiopia had been part of a global world. And the faith carried forward by Ezana now illuminated the mountains and valleys of Lasta, guiding the Zagwe and the people who looked to them for leadership. Medieval Ethiopia under the Zagwe demonstrated a vital truth. Civilizations can endure not only through conquest and wealth, but through culture, faith, and memory. The mountains preserve the people, and the people preserve the spirit of Axum. Even as centuries passed, the Zagwe dynasty inspired future rulers. The Solomonic dynasty, which would eventually succeed the Zagwe, traced its lineage back to the legendary union of King Solomon of Israel and the Queen of Sheba, a story deeply intertwined with Axumite history. The continuity of faith, monarchy, and culture created a sense of identity that would survive until modern times. By the end of the Zagwe period, Ethiopia had become a land where Axum's ancient achievements were not forgotten. The rock-hewn churches, the chants in Ge'ez, and the memory of Axumite kings all became pillars of national pride. The people learned that greatness could survive even when empires fell, that the spirit of a civilization can outlive the stone it carved, the gold it minted, and the lands it once ruled. Medieval Ethiopia was, in many ways, a bridge between worlds, between the ancient empire of Axum and the future nation that would rise in its image. Its kings were guardians of faith, culture, and memory, ensuring that Axum's light continued to shine across generations. And so, as this hour draws to a close, we see that the story of Axum is not only a tale of wealth and conquest, it is a story of resilience, adaptation, and continuity. From the highlands of northern Ethiopia to the mountains of Lasta, from the stelae to the rock-hewn churches, the legacy of Axum endured. Ethiopia's medieval kingdoms were more than successors. They were stewards of a civilization that had once stood among the greatest in the world. Through faith, language, architecture, and culture, Axum's spirit lived on, teaching that even when empires fade, their ideas and values can endure for centuries. By the late 13th century, the Zagwe dynasty had ruled Ethiopia for centuries, carrying the legacy of Axum in faith and culture. But a new chapter was about to begin. The Solomonic dynasty emerged, claiming descent from the legendary union of King Solomon of Israel and the Queen of Sheba, a lineage that connected Ethiopia directly to the ancient world and to Axum's glory. With the rise of the Solomonic kings, Ethiopia entered a period often called its Golden Christian era. These rulers built upon the foundations laid by Axum and the Zagwe, creating a kingdom that was politically strong, culturally rich, and spiritually vibrant. Their capital shifted from the mountains of Lasta to the highlands around Gondar and later other strategic cities, blending defense, governance, and religious prominence. Christianity remained the cornerstone of Ethiopian identity. Monasteries flourished across mountains, valleys, and remote islands in Lake Tana. Priests copied scriptures in Ge'ez, preserving both sacred texts and the rich traditions of art, music, and language. Hymns, chants, and illuminated manuscripts connected people across the kingdom to the faith that Axum had embraced centuries before. The Solomonic kings understood that religion was not just a private belief, it was the heart of governance and society. Churches were built in stone and timber, decorated with vivid paintings, intricate crosses, and carvings depicting biblical stories. These sacred spaces became centers of learning, diplomacy, and community, much like the ancient cities of Axum had been in their time. Trade and diplomacy also played a vital role. While Ethiopia's position was no longer at the center of Red Sea commerce like Axum, the kingdom maintained contacts with neighboring regions, Arab states, and even distant European powers. Gold, ivory, incense, and exotic animals still moved through its lands, connecting the highlands to the wider world. Foreign visitors marveled at the Christian faith, the majestic churches, and the enduring culture of a people who had survived centuries of change. The Solomonic kings also continued Axum's tradition of monumental architecture. Fortified castles, churches, and bridges were constructed to project strength and ensure stability. Like the stelae of old, these structures were symbols of authority and faith, connecting the present with the memory of Axum's grandeur. Education and scholarship thrived. Monks and scholars translated texts, recorded history, and taught philosophy and theology. The chronicles of the Solomonic kings often referenced Aksum, Lalibela, and the Zagwe dynasty, creating a continuous narrative that linked Ethiopia's medieval kingdoms to their ancient origins. Children learned that their country's greatness was not accidental, but the result of centuries of endurance, faith, and vision. Military power was also maintained to protect the kingdom and its faith. While the Solomonic kings did not seek to dominate the seas as Axum had, they fortified mountain passes, commanded armies to defend borders, and engaged diplomatically with neighboring states. This balance of defense, culture, and faith ensured that Ethiopia remained independent in a world of rising empires. The Golden Christian era was also marked by cultural achievements. Ethiopian art, music, and literature reached new heights. Icons and illuminated manuscripts were created with meticulous care. Stories of biblical heroes were retold in local traditions, blending the universal with the uniquely Ethiopian. In every church, monastery, and school, the spirit of Axum echoed, reminding the people of a legacy that spanned continents and centuries. Throughout this period, the memory of Axum remained alive. Festivals, religious ceremonies, and oral traditions celebrated the kings and merchants of the ancient empire. Pilgrimages to sacred sites reinforced the connection between past and present, showing that even as political power shifted, cultural and spiritual identity endured. The Solomonic dynasty, through centuries of rulers, strengthened the sense of a unified Ethiopian identity. They protected the faith, nurtured the culture, and preserved the language of Ge'ez. Their reign demonstrated that greatness could survive not just in armies or wealth, but in the ability to carry forward the soul of a civilization. Even when challenges arose, droughts, rival kingdoms, or foreign incursions, the people drew upon the lessons of Axum and the Zagwe. Resilience, faith, and adaptation were the true weapons of the kingdom. Through education, ritual, and memory, Ethiopia maintained continuity, showing that an empire's power is measured not only in its conquests, but in the endurance of its culture and identity. By the end of this golden Christian era, Ethiopia stood as a testament to the enduring influence of Axum. From the stelae of the highlands to the rock-hewn churches of Lalibela, and now to the fortified cities and flourishing monasteries of the Solomonic kings, the legacy of the ancient empire had been transformed into a living, thriving civilization. This era teaches a timeless lesson. Empires may rise and fall, but the ideas, faith, and culture they foster can transcend time. Axum's vision, Lalibela's devotion, and the Solomonic king's governance created a continuous thread that connected Ethiopia's ancient past to its medieval strength and ultimately to the Ethiopia we know today. As the Solomonic dynasty strengthened Ethiopia, the kingdom faced a world of both opportunity and challenge. While the faith and culture of Axum and the Zagwe continued to thrive, geography and politics presented constant trials. The highlands protected the people, but isolation could also be a burden, limiting trade and exposing Ethiopia to new rivalries. Internal challenges arose as regional nobles and distant provinces occasionally resisted central authority. Kings needed to balance diplomacy and military power to maintain unity. Fortresses in the mountains, careful governance, and wise delegation ensured that the Solomonic kings could rule over the diverse peoples of Ethiopia, from the fertile valleys to the rugged highlands. At the same time, Ethiopia was not alone in the world. European explorers, missionaries, and merchants began to look across the Red Sea. Portugal, in particular, reached out to Ethiopia during the 15th and 16th centuries, seeking allies against Islamic powers that dominated the trade routes. Letters, gifts, and envoys traveled back and forth, marking one of the first sustained European contacts with sub-Saharan Africa. These contacts brought both opportunities and tensions. Portuguese muskets and advisors helped Ethiopian kings defend against external threats, while missionaries sought to influence the church. Yet Ethiopia skillfully maintained its identity, adopting useful innovations while preserving its traditions, its faith, and its monarchy. During this period, Ethiopia faced repeated threats from Muslim sultanates along its borders, as well as from shifting alliances in the Red Sea and Horn of Africa. Armies had to defend fertile lands, strategic passes, and holy sites. Yet even in these conflicts, the principles inherited from Axum endured: faith as a unifying force, culture as a symbol of legitimacy, and mountains as both refuge and foundation. Trade, while no longer dominated by Axum's Red Sea ports, continued to flourish on a smaller scale. Merchants carried coffee, gold, ivory, and textiles from the highlands to the coasts, connecting Ethiopia to the world beyond its mountains. In return, European and Arabian traders brought new knowledge, goods, and technologies, enriching the medieval kingdom while respecting its ancient traditions. Culturally, the medieval period saw the flowering of Ethiopian art, literature, and music. Churches were decorated with frescoes depicting biblical scenes, saints, and kings. Manuscripts illuminated with gold and vivid pigments preserved both religious teachings and historical memory. Every hymn, every scroll, every stone church was a testament to Axum's enduring influence. The people of Ethiopia continued to see themselves as heirs of Axum. Festivals, pilgrimages, and royal ceremonies often recalled Ezana, Lalibela, and the ancient kings of the highlands. Even centuries after the decline of Axum, the memory of its greatness shaped governance, architecture, and faith. Children learned stories of stelae, coins, and distant ports, understanding that their civilization had once been counted among the world's great empires. By the 16th century, Ethiopia faced new external pressures, including Portuguese and Ottoman interests in the region, yet the kingdom's resilience remained unmatched. Faith remained the backbone of society. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church preserved rituals, language, and moral guidance. Monasteries in remote mountains became centers of education and community life. And the symbols of Axum, crosses, manuscripts, and memory of the stelae, continued to inspire generations. Even as kingdoms rose and fell elsewhere, Ethiopia preserved its unique continuity. From the mountains of Axum to the cities of Gondar, the legacy of the ancient empire endured through culture, faith, and memory. The story of Aksum, Lalibela, and the Solomonic kings became a living history, showing that greatness is measured not only by conquest, but by the endurance of civilization itself. This period demonstrates a timeless truth. An empire may lose its ports, its armies, or its political dominance, yet its ideas, faith, and cultural identity can survive for centuries. Ethiopia became a bridge across time, connecting Africa's ancient past with the medieval world and carrying the spirit of Axum forward into the modern era. And so from the highlands of Axum to the fortified cities of the Solomonic kings, Ethiopia endured. It survived conquest, shifting trade, and the tides of history, carrying forward a legacy of faith, culture, and resilience that began over 1,000 years ago. Axum's stelae, Lalibela's rock-hewn churches, the Gaia's manuscripts, and the proud traditions of the Solomonic kings all tell the same story. That greatness is not only in power or wealth, but in the endurance of a people and their culture. This is the story of Ethiopia, a kingdom that bridges Africa's ancient past to the medieval world, carrying the spirit of Axum into every era. And yet, the story is not finished. The journey continues, through Gondar, through the coming centuries, and into the Ethiopia we know today. Join us in the next episode as we continue the untold story of Ethiopia, from Gondar to the rise of modern Ethiopia, and the enduring legacy of Axum. Like, comment, share, subscribe, see in the next episode.